All right, so now it's time for us to take a look at the location services. Now there's different ways to get the location services, meaning the location of your Android device. Now obtaining the location information for a device can be very complicated. So activating GPS and other hardware components uses a lot of power. Now to find device location effectively without worrying about which provider or network type to use, we have a new class or new interface called FusedLocationProvider client. All of this comes, of course, with our location services. So let's go ahead and set up our Fused location client. The first thing we're going to do here is we're going to implement a few interfaces that we're going to be needing in our class here. So the first one I'm going to add is going to be, I'm going to say implements Google Play client, but I want to go and get the on connection callbacks first. Let's see, on connection callbacks. I can keep implementing other items too. I want a Google client dot the on connection failed, and I want to go add location listener like that. All right, very good. So once we implement all of these interfaces here, we will have obviously to override a few methods. So click that and you can see there's all of these highlighted. Just go ahead and say okay, and we should have all of them. We already have created our Google API client and we've set it up, so everything is good here. So we said Google API builder, we want location services and so forth. But the other thing we also want to be able to have here is that I'm going to add the connection callback. So I'm going to say dot add connection failed callback. I'm going to pass this. I'm going to be able to pass this because it's already implemented, or I'm calling inside of this app activity, which is main activity, right? That's why I'm listening, registering here, say this. Just like what we did with buttons before. All right, so I'm going to also register the connection callbacks and pass this. Okay, this meaning again that we are connecting to our main activity, which will be listening around here with all of these override methods. Next thing here, I'm going to create a private instance variable here, and this is going to be Fused Provider Client. Now notice we have two of them here. There's this Fused Location Provider API, and it's crossed out, which means it's deprecated, so we should not use that. We're going to use the Fused Location Provider Client, so click like that. And of course, in our main here, the first thing we're going to do is instantiate it. Look, I need to actually give a name like this. Let's go ahead and instantiate it. So I'm going to fuse provider is equal to location services, right? Invoke that. We're going to get the fuse location provider client, and we have to pass main.this. Okay, we have to, of course, pass the actual context. Next, I'm going to create an array list of permissions. So I'm going to say here private array list. They're just going to have strings, okay? And I'm going to call this permissions to request. Because as you remember, in order for us to be able to get location, maps, location, and so forth, we have to make sure that inside of our manifest here, we've added the access final location and course location. Right? So here we're going to create this array list contain all these permissions. So that way we can use them to make sure that indeed the user has accepted those permissions. You will see in a second here. So I'm just going to put all of these inside of an array list. That way it's easy for us to do things with it. So the next one I'm going to actually add, I'm going to create another array list, which we're going to be using soon. It's going to be of string. And this is going to be permissions. Okay. I'm going to just instantiate it and go is equal to new array list like that. We're going to use it in a second here. And while I'm here, I'm going to create another private array list of strings. And this is going to be, I'm going to call this permissions rejected. So we want to make sure that if there are permissions that will be rejected, we want to keep track of them. So it's new array list like that. This is not 100% necessary, but I like to put it this way so we can organize everything. You'll see in a second here. Very good. So back down here after our fused location provider client instantiated, I'm going to go ahead and say something like let's add permissions we need to request location of the users. So here I'm going to say permissions. I'm going to add, right, because it's an array list, I'm going to add manifest. Right? I can invoke the manifest class, really. So I'm literally coming here. I'm going to say manifest dot permission dot access find location, like that. That's the first one. I'm going to also add this other permission that we need. So manifest dot permission dot course location. Okay, so we need those two that we're going to be using to check to make sure that those permissions are actually accepted and so forth. At the bottom here, I'm going to say permissions to request. Remember that array list we created? I'm going to set it to a function that we haven't created yet. So I'm going to say permissions to request. I'm going to say permissions to request, which is going to be a method, and then I'm going to pass all the permissions like this. All right, so let's go ahead and create this method here. I know the namings are very similar. Create this method there. So there we go. So this is going to be permissions to request, which actually we're going to pass all of the permissions in an array list. So what we're going to do here, very simply, is we are just going to create a quick array list here holder of string. I'm going to call this result. I'm going to say new array list, instantiate it. So at this point here, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to change this to wanted permissions so we can differentiate things a little bit here. Next, what I'm going to do, I'm going to loop through this wanted permissions here and make sure that indeed the permissions that we are asking have already been asked and accepted. I'm going to create for loop. I'm going to make this advanced for loop. I'm going to say string perm like this, and I'm going to call our wanted permissions. So here I'm creating a string variable that is going to go and get all the permissions inside of our wanted permissions, which essentially is what we are passing when we ask here, right? We are getting all permissions to request when we're passing these permissions there, right? So now inside here, I'm going to check first to make sure that each permission that I'm going to be adding into this new array list, if it's already permitted or not. So I'm going to say if not has permission, and I'm going to pass our perm. So each item, each permission that we are getting from our wanted permissions array, we're going to go and check if it's good to go or not. Okay. Obviously, we haven't created this. Let's go ahead and create this method, helper method there. This help method here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say if build.version int that version that SDK int like that is greater or equal than build that version codes that is that m like that. If that's the case, and then I'm going to return this method called check self permission. In this case here, I'm going to go ahead and pass our permission that we are passing and see if that is equal to package manager, okay, dot permission granted. And then I'm just returning true. Okay, what's really happening here? Well, we're just saying here, whatever permission that we're passing, we're going to check the build version of our SDK that we're using. If it's greater than build version code M, this is not going to work for us because we already are at a higher level, meaning our API build is higher. At this point, I think it's 26, if I may. So this is not going to work for us, or doesn't really matter. But I'm putting it here because in case that you have a lower version of Android, then this will actually work. Okay, so we're checking everything there. So in fact, if you click here and try to unwrap the if statement, because that is never going to really do any difference for us, you notice that it's going to just get rid of everything and just call this return. But we don't want that. I'm going to leave this way just in case, like I said, if you are actually on a lower version, which you shouldn't, but just in case, right? And then I'm just going to go and make sure to check the self permission. So there's this method. We're going to pass the string permission and say, in this case here, the permission could be the access find location, for instance, right? We're going to check to make sure that it's granted like that. If it's true, then it just returns true. That's all. Very good. So at the top here, you notice that has permission, goes ahead and check. If this is not true, meaning that indeed this permission hasn't been checked or hasn't been accepted, then we're going to just say result dot add, we're going to add that permission, okay? Because we know that, okay, this permission is not there, so the user hasn't really accepted this permission. We're going to add to our permission to request. So essentially here, if you think about it, we are just creating these different data structures that will really help us in the long run to keep track of all the permissions that have been checked or permissions that haven't been checked, and we add them to an array list so that we know what to ask the users for permission to do things. Okay, that's pretty much all. In fact, the names here, as you can see, they tell it all, permissions to request, right? So that means now we're adding this new permission to request if indeed a permission is not requested yet. All right. Okay, so we're making good progress here, and I'll see you in the next video.